Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to this meeting of the Progressive Christian Network of Victoria. And may I remind you that wherever you are located, either here at the Ewing Memorial Centre in Malvern East, or sitting comfortably in the warmth of your own home on Zoom, that you are on the country of a First Nations group. Here at the Ewing Centre, we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people, and we recognise their elders and ancestors with respect. This meeting is one of a series that has been put together in terms of inviting the participants here and on Zoom to explore how the Christianity we chose influences how we live, and anchoring that back under some of the most influential writers and speakers on those subjects in recent times. I will now introduce you to, or hand over to Lorna Henry, who will talk about the meeting today and introduce our star guest speaker.
Thanks, Dick. Hearty welcome to everyone here in person and on Zoom. It's lovely to see a goodly number here. And thank you for sticking with the series, because I'm part of a team of the people of Progressive Christian Network who put together this program to really look back at the heroes of another way of looking at our faith and inspiration for living. So this is the third in the series, and it's the second one that we've devoted to Bishop John Spong, and its title is It's All About Living. Last time we looked at John Spong, we talked about his view on the Bible, this time living. And as I've said each time, when you come here, as particularly for those in person, we hope that it's a time when you can discuss with other people, share your thoughts, hear what other people are thinking, and have time to talk about the meaning for your life. Today, we have three speakers to introduce and reflect on the writings of Bishop John Spong. David Merritt, I have to say, was the sort of inspiration, the key idea behind these series. And David's one of our speakers today, but our main speaker is well known to us, Dr. Val Webb, whom I'll introduce more fully later. And the third speaker is Anne Page, who's with us here at Ewing. And Anne is a member of the Progressive Christian Network, and she will offer her reflections too on what the writings and thoughts of John Spong have meant to her. So the first thing I'm going to do is to ask David Merritt, who's with us on Zoom, to introduce to us a selection of writings, a page of key writings of Spong, and make his comments about those. So can we hand over to David now?
Thank you, Val. I just want to make a few comments about the man Spong before we screen the extracts from his writings. He was a marvellous human being and has made an enormous contribution to flexible contemporary understandings of Christianity. He was born in 1931 and he died just a few years ago in 2021. He was Bishop of Newark, a diocese of the Episcopal Church in America, but he and others referred to him as the bishop to the church alumni, that is, the bishop to the people who'd left the church because of its beliefs or its practices. And most of his writing is really directed to people who want or need a new understanding of Christianity compared with the tradition they found in the churches around them. He's one of the most prolific writers about contemporary Christianity. And if I mention just a few of his well-known titles, some of you will recognize them. Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism, 1991. Why Christianity Must Change or Die, 1996. A New Christianity for a New Age, 2001. Jesus for the Non-Religious, 2007. And the most recent and comprehensive title, which I don't know how well you can see that on the screen. The answer is not well. 270 pages of his statement on why present Christianity is unbelievable and why neither ancient creeds nor the Reformation can produce a living faith today. And I'm about to screen extracts from that book in which every word is a copy of Spong's words. I've made no change to it. I have, however, highlighted some key words on some of the frames in red to attract your attention to them. This volume lists 12 theses for a revitalized Christianity, and I've just selected a small number of quotes, but I've included the first three theses because they're fundamental to everything else Spong says, and because I know from experience some people skip those first theses because they seem too confronting or too challenging. So here we go on Spong's statements. Thanks, Greg. As Lorna said, the theme of this session is it's all about how you live. Spong said, the meaning of the incarnation to me is that the life of God is always met in the human. Christianity is not about religion, it is about life. I claim today and will in the foreseeable future claim for myself the title Christian, but I reserve the right to define what that title means. The first thesis in his final statement is this: understanding God in theistic terms as a being, supernatural in power, dwelling somewhere external to the world and capable of intervening in the world with miraculous power is no longer believable. Most God talk in liturgy and conversation has thus become meaningless. What we must do is find the meaning to which the word God points. Thesis 2 is about the Christ. If God can no longer be thought of in theistic terms, then conceiving Jesus as the incarnation of the theistic deity has also become a bankrupt concept. Can we place new meaning into that term? Greg, we've skipped the wrong way. Thank you. Theme 3, thesis 3. Thank you. The biblical story of the perfect and finished creation from which we human beings have fallen into original sin is pre-Darwinian mythology and post-Darwinian nonsense. We have to find a new way to tell the old story. For Darwin, creation was an ongoing, never to be finished evolutionary process. Human beings were thus forced to draw some radically new conclusions. Without an original perfection in creation itself, there could not have been a fall from perfection.
Policy number, is that what you need?
Everybody cut off their microphones, please. Next frame. If the story of human life is one of unfinishedness, then the work of God is not to save us from our sins, but to bring about human completeness or wholeness. We are not fallen sinners indelibly infected with original sin. We are evolving people. We need to be loved and empowered so that we're enabled to become all that we are capable of being. I find this unity between the divine and the human powerfully expressed in the parable of the judgment, a parable told only in Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew chapter 25. When I get later on in the program to say something about what Spong means to me personally, I actually will comment on this. But for the time being, what the parable tells in ancient terms is a judgment at the end of the world, when the judge divides people into one of two groups, one to the left and one to the right. And he says to those on one side, "Come, you blessed of my Father, for the reward prepared for you from the foundation of the earth. For I was hungry and you fed me, I was naked and you clothed me, I was in prison and you visited me." And it goes on through a whole list of categories where the people have met the needs of human beings. And the people responded, "When did we see you hungry? When did we see you naked? When did we see you in prison and visit you?" Spong's comment is that no one asked those being judged whether or not they had recited the creeds, attended worship regularly, or even lived moral lives. Judgment in this parable was both simple and universal. Did you discern and respond to the presence of the holy in the life of the least of these your brothers and sisters? The Christianity of the future must also be willing and able to dialogue with the other great religious systems of the world without defining any of them as lacking or deficient. Our task is not to judge, but to accept them as they are, to call them to live fully, loved wastefully, and be all that they can be in the infinite variety of our humanity. I believe I have experienced God as the source of life. If God is the source of life, then the only way I can appropriately worship God is by living fully. If God is the source of love, then the only way I can worship God is by loving wastefully, a phrase that I like. By wasteful love, I mean the kind of love that never stops to calculate whether the object of its love is worthy to be its recipient. It is love that loves not because love has been earned. If God is the ground of being, then the only way I can worship God is by having the courage to be all that I can be. So the reality of God to me is discovered in the experience which compels me to live fully, to love wastefully, and to have the courage to be all that I can. This is the faith I seek to share with the world: to embrace life, to increase love, and to have the courage to be. These for me are the doorways through which I walk into the mystery of God. This God is real to me, and Jesus is still my doorway into this reality. Those are the statements from Spong which undergird and lie behind the following parts of our program.
Thank you, David. David's contribution there was to bring to us the words of Bishop John Spong. David will speak again later as one of three whom we've asked to give their reflections on how these writings and thoughts of this man have influenced their living. We asked a special and expert person called Dr. Val Webb to join us and give her reflections. Val is known to many of us, and to those who have not known Val, I'd like you to know that she and her background covers a wide range. There's microbiology, there's business, there's PR, art, and theology. In fact, she has her doctorate in theology. She is the author of 11 books and continues to be a teacher and a lecturer in matters of faith and theology. Val was originally from Brisbane, but she now lives in Mudgee, lucky person, rural New South Wales, with her husband Morris and her family. And she joins us now on Zoom from Mudgee to give her reflections on how the work of John Spong, his books, his thinking have had an influence on her life and the very living of it. Thank you, Val, very much.
Thank you, Lorna. Can you all hear me? Good. As Lorna said, I've been asked to reflect on Jack Spong's writings and how his ideas have made a difference to the way I live. And might I say, it's always fun to be with you in this group. You're one of my lifelines living in the country. Spong has certainly been a significant open gate in my evolution. It's hard to narrow down just one or two writers. So many of you know my story because I've laid myself bare in many books over the years. But I think I'd like to just remind you of some of that so that you can see the difference where I've come from. I grew up in a family where religion and education were dominant forces. My father was a professor and my equally bright mother was denied university during the Depression, so it was inevitable that I would go to university and also to do science. We were evangelical Christians in the tradition of high school crusaders and scripture union and intervarsity fellowship at university, of which my father was one of the leaders. In the 60s, IVF in Queensland was vehemently opposed to SCM and to the book Honest to God. Through all this, I had serious questions about aspects of belief, but in this environment, couldn't really share my doubts, and so I struggled on to try and believe everything. I eventually went back to university in my 40s to do religious studies, to get some answers, or basically to walk away if I couldn't. There I discovered that what I had been trying to resolve for a quarter of a century was openly discussed at university, but this never reached any church pew in which I sat. I went on to do a PhD in theology in America, reveling in all this new thinking. For my PhD, I had to read every white male from Germany, England, or America that ever said anything about theology, but my heart found its home in liberation and feminist theology, which gave priority to one's own experience and to one's context, and also in process theology, where everything is in God and God is the initial aim within everything, urging us on towards richness. I wrote my book In Defense of Doubt while still doing my PhD, arguing that doubt is the essential catalyst for new thought, not an enemy for faith. I discovered Spong and Borg after I had written the Doubts book. Borg's book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, had been published the year before my book, and Spong's Born of a Woman a year before that. I also discovered that the university professor, Paul Sponheim, who had introduced me into process theology and had been my savior in PhD days, was also the professor who had set Marcus Borg on his progressive path as a young man. So when I first read Spong, I was already open to the wildest of deconstruction, and his iconoclasm delighted me rather than shocked. However, now when people begin a progressive voyage and ask me what I recommend for them to read, I recommend The Gentler Borg first, so their boat does not capsize too quickly. With Spong's Why Christianity Must Change or Die, I suggest people read the epilogue first, where Spong actually states what he does believe before they read the first few chapters where he ruthlessly challenges everything. I reread Spong's book Unbelievable for today's discussion. He basically rejects everything I struggled to believe for the first 40 years of my life. which is why I began today with that brief summary of how my mind has changed. I wish I had read Unbelievable when I was 20, but my religious group would simply have called it heresy, and I would have felt condemned and chastened. That's the problem for the progressive journey. If people look to their church to answer their hard questions, they are unlikely, except in a few situations, to find someone in authority who will address their questions as openly as Spong does. And in many churches, Spong's name has been demonized because he threatens the doctrinal status quo. It can be like pushing the proverbial stone up a hill to introduce new ways of thinking, yet there's a hunger for it, even in those most set in conservative ways. Clinging desperately to the faith of their childhood is often a defensive stance when they have no access to other ways to think. I know because I've been there. I preached at our local church this Easter, and having sat through many Easters hoping a preacher would say honestly what they did and did not believe about the resurrection, I preached on how the New Testament accounts vary and do not demand a resuscitated body. Some of the pew sitters whom I thought would be quite disturbed thanked me profusely and even tearfully and wanted to know more. So where am I now? Spong claims the title Christian, but wants to define what he means by it. Unfortunately, one doesn't always get that chance. Once you say, I am a Christian, that statement no longer belongs to you, but belongs to whatever the hearer wants it to mean. Even saying I'm a Christian today causes cold shivers in me because of the years this was code for a whole set of beliefs I no longer hold. On Facebook recently, a Uniting Church leader referred to something that we could share with our non-Christian friends. Now, he may have meant those of faiths other than Christianity, but it brought back for me so many self-righteous memories of defining who was and who wasn't a Christian, depending on my narrow evangelical criteria. Today, I rarely say I'm a Christian because that label doesn't convey to the average person who I am. Even using the word Christ for Jesus of Nazareth conveys too much bad theology for me. A follower of the way of Jesus better describes where I am, but it's a mouthful. And by the time I finish saying it, the hearer has simply lost interest. Like Spong, I challenge so much of Christian theology: virgin birth, bodily resurrection, miracles, Trinity, atonement, etc., knowing from my studies how these doctrines have evolved. Whereas earlier in my progressive path, I may have challenged these more gently, I am more blunt in my old age. I simply think traditional Christianity is a different religion from the way I think today. Its doctrines penetrate so completely our church hymns, our liturgies and prayers, and ooze out of Bible readings because for so long these stories have been told in a certain way. And to substitute repetitive, empty choruses and overhead projections of flowers, sunrise, and running water as worship doesn't solve my problems. Perhaps I've reached an age of intolerance, but there is too much dissonance for me in what is called worship today, even the word, as Spong points out. In terms of how I live then, Sunday church brings me more angst than affirmation, but unfortunately we are still judged by whether we attend or not. The way we live, as Spong points out, depends on how we imagine God in relation to ourselves. As David's already mentioned, Spong calls incarnation how the life of God is met in the human. This locates incarnation on what we know and experience as human beings, the here and now, rather than on what we don't know but endlessly surmise, what God did somewhere else in some cosmic scheme. To imagine God as Tillich's ground of being, or process theology's initial urge within everything, or Spong's source of life and love, also locates God's activity in the human realm, not in some far-off transcendent construct of our creation. This change of focus turns everything upside down for me as to how we live. In my earlier years, God was somewhere up there, out there, separate from me. I was obsessed about reaching out to that God, getting closer to and experiencing that God, or earning brownie points from that God out there. The onus was always on me to pray, to witness, to seek God to close the gap. That famous Sistine Chapel painting of God and Adam's fingers never quite touching said it all. I was never where God was, always searching for something somewhere else. To be human was never enough. God as ground of being, or being itself, the source or depth of everything, changes the visuals for me as well as the location. Although I did science a long time ago, I am more of a visual artist, painting with words and brushes. I'm more comfortable visualizing something than wrangling philosophical concepts. If the mystery we call God is within everything, within me, and if I am within that mystery in this universe, I no longer have to go anywhere or do anything to seek God, whatever we call God. I am there within the cradle of this mystery. It is enough to be human, not forever found wanting. To repeat what Spong says, incarnation is about how the life of God is met in the human, not some cosmic drama somewhere else. I have to learn to relax into that image, to feel complete as a human being, and from this location, this human location, live fully, love wastefully, and be all I can be, as Spong says. For some people, this realization and visualization of being already within the source of life and love doesn't end their activity of searching for God. They continue to seek, but in a different place, going inward through meditation or mysticism or whatever. They're still on the move to be united with God, which is fine, but it's not where I am. Perhaps because I have been so wounded after a whole life of searching. Some people also seek dramatic God experiences. Borg speaks of being surrounded by light, which he calls a God experience. Something like that is no doubt worth holding on to, but I haven't had those experiences, no matter how much in the past I have yearned for them. So again, I have had to work at simply imagining my life as being at home, now at home, fully and validly human, and grounded in the ground of being which grounds all the universe. Although I was once a scientist, as I've said, scientist, I can't claim to understand a fraction of the amazing universe that we're discovering. I can't even imagine how Spong's source of life and love works within this universe as the ground of being. But using words like mystery and being itself are reasonably vague enough to sit with me. We have to say something, even while realizing that any descriptive words fail as soon as they leave our lips. To choose to imagine a God space, whatever we call it, is not something we can prove, no matter how much theological gymnastics we attempt. It's a faith statement to choose something rather than nothing. Is it more reasonable for me to imagine a God space within this expanding universe than not? To be perfectly honest, I answer this question differently from time to time. And we'll all answer this differently. And our answer is not something that we have to defend. If we are truly honest, we are all as ignorant on this question as each other. Even if we have had experiences of God, through meditation or unexpected visions, it is still our faith choice to describe them in that way and not some other way. At the end of his book, How Christianity Must Change or Die, Spong describes his stance. He says, I believe that there is a transcending reality present in the very heart of life. I name that reality God. I believe that this reality has a bias towards life and wholeness, and that its presence is experienced as that which calls us beyond all our fearful and fragile human limits. So in this rambling way, I'm saying that the aim of my life is no longer to be religious, but to be human, to live fully in this world as a human being, rather than seeking the divine life somewhere else. Because as humans, I believe we are already within the mystery. I don't have to accept Jesus Christ as my Savior. I don't have to confess my sins. I don't have to pray more. All I am capable of being is human, not something else. And to be human is to be an authentic, complete part of the mystery. This has taken me a lifetime to learn. I choose by faith and some rational thinking and wondering what Spong calls the source of life and love and being. And because of this, I choose to be fully human, to love wastefully and make the best of being a human being. So how can we do this? The reading in Matthew 25 about judging the nations makes it pretty clear that it's actually what we do for others that counts, loving one another, rather than going to church, praying more, and believing the right stuff. I found the recent book, After Jesus and Before Christianity, from the Jesus Seminar, very helpful because it gave us a closer look at the earliest communities of the Anointed One, who composed these communities and what they may have been like. The early followers saw the way of Jesus, the way of life modeled in Jesus, and his sayings guided them as to how to live under the reign of God, not Caesar. We need to see these followers within the violent context of their lives and the rules and regulations of both Roman and Jewish society, how they lived out their love for others. As Jesus of Nazareth became in time the Greek divine human Son of God, the perfect sinless life that eclipsed all other possible human lives, we lost the earthiness and the immediacy of the man Jesus and his call to those who followed him to also experience the Spirit or Comforter within them. However, while Spong calls Jesus his doorway into the reality of God, there are other people who have gone before us who also model ways of living fully and being all we can be. Florence Nightingale talked about this in her day. She didn't see Jesus as the only savior, but believed constantly that God constantly sent saviors at different times to help people in need, to save them in their situations. She included herself, of course, which was a brave stance considering English theology in Victorian times. This is our challenge I think, to examine our gifts, our experiences, and our opportunities to see how we're called to be saviors for those around us. There are so many needs today: saving the planet, addressing violence against women, poverty, conflict between nations, corruption, etc. There is so much need to love and to be loved. And as followers of the way of Jesus, we need to be onto this. Matthew's Jesus talked about feeding the hungry, healing the sick, visiting the prisoners, clothing the naked. So much, unfortunately, today of this has become political, gauged on what is and isn't deserved. In today's politics, any act of love or compassion voiced across party lines, any acceptance of someone else's position is seen as weakness or even treachery. Changing one's mind when better information comes to light is considered blameworthy, not thoughtful. Economic systems exist that reduce older women to sleeping in their cars after a lifetime of supporting and living for their families. Children are stuck in hopeless poverty because of systems that trap them and their parents. At my age, I can no longer solve all the problems of the world, something I once thought was possible, but there's no limit to how I can show love for those who desperately need it in our communities, our schools, our aged care homes, even in the smallest of ways. Social media are full of stories of random acts of kindness held up as the rarest of occurrences, not something that should be expected when people love wastefully. How can I be all that I can be is something I reflect on as I age. What is our calling when we are no longer in circles where we previously contributed, whether in professions or in raising families? What can we do now without overstaying our welcome in the halls of power we once trod, either in public office or our homes? I've been recording our family history and my story, and I'm sure all of you are doing this as well. This is not to ensure that what I have done is celebrated for posterity, but because it will help our children and grandchildren better understand their place in the world. This is important if we take our humanness and uniqueness seriously. You only have to chat with somebody for a few minutes to realize how much the stories they tell of their lives and families create who they are and how they see themselves. We tell our stories to be human. While I was writing this, a young Punjabi Sikh born in Australia was interviewed on TV. He told how he had tried to assimilate into Australia as a child, become Australian, losing his family language, so it ended up he could no longer talk to his grandmother. Later, he realized he was not being himself, but someone else. So now he writes stories of his parents and their migration so they can all remember who they really are. I look back on my teenage and young adult years and I realized I was not being myself. I was trying to be the type of Christian others told me I should be, not doing lots of things that would have brought me great joy. So many of us wish we had asked our parents more when they were alive to understand what shaped them and consequently us as human beings. This grounds us. A niece of mine recently called me to ask about her mother, my sister, who has Alzheimer's. What sort of teenager was she? What was she like as a young adult? What was her passions? She was wanting to know more of her mother and thus of herself, now that her mother has slipped into the fog of lost memories. This is all important work at the heart of being human. I've been wanting to set up something in our town through Rotary or the church where volunteers sit with elderly folk, the last of their family line, to help them record their story so they have something to pass on to their descendants. So they are remembered. Like Spong, I'm passionate about dialogue between religions. During my PhD work, I veered substantially into interfaith dialogue subjects. I think Spong's iconoclasm towards doctrinal certainty and claims of uniqueness go a long way to aiding this dialogue. This is not to dissolve our differences, but rather for each of us to share who we are without judgment, and through that sharing, come away a richer whatever we were before. In this way, we offer each other not just a set of beliefs, but our humanness, the one thing that can bind us together. I remember once sitting on a mountain in India, looking at the sunset with some Hindu friends. I asked one of them just to talk, just to describe how he sees his faith and why it's important to him. I could say yes to everything he said, because what we were sharing was how to be human, even though the religious garments in which this was dressed were of different colors. There's so much more that I could say, but I want to hear from you. Let me finish with how I've finished many talks. I have currently chosen a God space even though I've no proof or even an adequate description. The evolution of my journey is far from complete. The one thing I hold central is that I am a human being, and that is the limit within which I can journey. Past adventurers have thrown back over their shoulders hints and visions, often dressed in different metaphors from their contexts, which need careful unpacking if they are going to guide me today. In my experience and what I hear from others, it's more about the journey and the questions than about once I was blind, but now I see. Can you live with that? I can, because I can't do anything else. It's how I live with everything. A constant juggling of a few certain facts, constant new experiences, diverse opinions, and faith in many things, some scientifically verifiable and others not. It's simply the adventure of being alive. Thank you.
Thank you enormously, Val, for the word human above everything and the fact that we are all human. We share that for clarity about the possibilities that that brings. And also, thanks for sharing with us your own experience, because all of us have walked through perhaps similar times, or difficult ones at least. Thank you so much for the possibilities of all of that and your faithfulness to what Bishop John Spong was writing about. I'm going to ask now David Merritt to come back to us. David alluded to the fact that he's going to also offer his reflections on what John Spong has meant to him. Was I a little brief before about David? I just want to say that David, sorry, microphone's not working. Thank you. Has it been not working all the time? Right. Something's better now. Good. I don't know whether Val heard my enormous thanks to her, but I will just say that what you gave to us, Val, was filled with possibilities, and also the affirmation for all of us for being human and what that means and how deeply meaningful that is in our lives. Thank you. David Merritt is now going to speak about his reflections on John Spong's work. David has a very critical mind. I know David well, and he has a very critical mind, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Lorna. Perhaps I might start at a point where I have unbridled admiration for John Spong. And it's an experience that
David, can you hear me?
Yes.
We're not hearing you. I think you might be muted.
I'm not, but I'll. How about that?
We're hearing him on
That's
Zoom.
good. All is good. Let's go back to the beginning.
In the light of the reference to a critical mind, I thought I might start with an unbridled admiration for John Spong. And there is one particular experience that I, with some other members of the newly formed Committee for the Progressive Christian Network of Victoria, had in 2006, soon after the formation of the network. We found ourselves asked to guarantee a public meeting for Shelby Spong in the Malvern Town Hall. It was a 5-figure sum, and we didn't have a 3-figure sum in dollars, let alone a 5-figure sum, but a volunteer came forward to guarantee the amount. So one night we found ourselves sitting in the Malvern Town Hall, packed, every seat taken, for an address by Shelby Spong. The address itself isn't what lives strongly in my mind, although I could tell you what he said. It was that at that evening, he had invited the gay and lesbian choir of Melbourne to be the supporting musos for that evening. And I will not ever forget the impression of both affection and respect between those men and women in the gay and lesbian choir and Bishop Spong, because in him, they knew they were sharing space with one of the great, not just defenders, but one of the great mobilizers of acceptance for GBLTQ people. And he's done that around the world, in Australia as well as in the United States. And to see how that relationship between those young people and Spong was so dynamic is something that lives vividly in my memory. He is a great encourager of acceptance, of openness, and of diversity being desirable. Let me go back to a little bit about earlier life. I grew up as a conservative evangelical Christian. My family was conservative evangelical. It was a life about making a decision for Christ, faith in Jesus, saying prayers, daily Bible reading, very literalist and devotional readings from sometimes obscure parts of the Bible. And anything like the teachings of Spong didn't enter that world until I was well into late teens and early 20s. And gradually, through experiences in university courses where there was both history and philosophy, in study of theology in Australia and the United States, where diverse understandings of what religion was and what Christianity was, there were gradual changes in my life to be open to a much broader perspective on what enriches human life than I gained in that evangelical childhood. And in those adult years, I encountered the writings of John Shelby Spong and bought and read many of his books. And I can say that every one of his books was like walking through an open door to see in a fresh way some aspect of human experience. And that continues now. Like Val, I read and browsed through Spong's latest book to refresh my mind for this afternoon's event. When I come to think about the content of what Spong has done, I find a mixed response. I find that he opens doors to new possibilities, but then sometimes closes them with particular interpretations of human reality and religion that I don't share. Simple one. In one of the things he said in the passage I read from his writings tonight, in the light of theories about the evolution of life, he said we need new ways to tell the old story. My hunch is we actually need ways to tell a new story rather than being trapped too much in the old story. He talks about acceptance of evolutionary theory. My response there is the Origin of Species was published 160 plus years ago. Surely we've passed the point where that's regarded as new or novel, but it is in many churches and for many people speaking about religion and Christianity. I think he points us in the direction, he's pointed me in the direction often of aspects of life which need new illumination, but often a very different path to take. I was interested in his interpretation of that chapter in Matthew's Gospel, where an ancient approach to reality is taken in the story of the end of the world, where a judge assigns either reward or punishment to people. And Spong says that they were rewarded simply in response to one question. Did you see the holy in the lives of people? Now, for the life of me, I can't find that in the parable. In the parable, when people said, when did we see you, God, hungry or thirsty or needing clothing? The reply in the parable was, whenever you did anything to the needy, you did it to me. I can't see a glimmer of reference to the holy. And again, I think Spong, there I'm tempted to say he was backsliding into religion, but he does carry sometimes concepts of his in a very rich ecclesiastical tradition into the solutions he points to. So I have discovered enormous help from him opening doors, but not always wanting to walk through the particular way ahead that he points to. And that's going to be the experience of any of us as we find new ways to go ahead. So to John Shelby Spong, a very heartfelt thanks for all the wonder he's opened up for me and for many others. It's a wonderful contribution to being human.
Today is Anne Page. Anne is a member of our Progressive Christian Committee. She has a clinical psychology background, and she will bring her own reflections on John Spong. And I'm glad the microphone's working. That's good, isn't it? Thank you, Anne.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am just a full stop to some wonderful thoughts that we've had today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. It'll be a story that will probably be similar to yours some of the way. And I'd like to finish by actually reading from Spong himself, the last thing really that he wrote. I grew up in a very loving family. My parents had come from Anglican and Methodist backgrounds, but were searching for more answers about God and life's meaning. They found the Christadelphians and were impressed with the group's Bible scholarship. They were also very moved by the way a Christadelphian couple dealt with the loss of their eldest son to leukemia. My father, a young doctor, actually made the initial diagnosis. These people became dear family friends and fellow church members. I grew up being very involved with Bible studies, youth groups, and finding the true beliefs. Christadelphians are not an exclusive judgmental group, but they talk of having the truth. They also do not have pastors. So for my father often was a lay preacher, and the thing he always spoke about was love. That expression, the truth, was an expression that really started to jar with me. One of the truths was total immersion was the only way to be baptized if you were a true believer. But I was worried about other forms of Christian acceptance, let alone multi-faith. What about people such as Mother Teresa? If she had not been fully immersed, was she not one of God's faithful? I kept asking, and the answer was always, God will judge. I left home to study psychology in Western Australia. I kept meeting with the Christadelphians, but a wider world beckoned, and the final leave-taking came when I was talking to a lovely fellow churchwoman about singing an Easter Mass with the university choir. She said softly, "Perhaps you should withdraw." I was quite shocked at this narrowness of view, and I did not go to any more services. In ensuing years, I kept wrestling with what belief meant as I married, had children, and juggled work and other competing demands. We returned to Victoria and I joined the local Baptist church as the gathering I felt most in sync with. I wanted to give my children some Christian education, but was not happy to simply send them to Sunday school. The minister at this church asked the same questions I did. I was stunned. Chris and Judith Page became dear friends. They left to live in Canada, and in the ensuing 10 years, my marriage ended and I continued alone. Chris and Judith returned, and to everyone's shock, they too separated. Some years later, Chris and I became close, and our conversations were so often centered on faith and belief. I had a lot of beliefs. It was heavy to be always wondering what God is. Around that time, I started to go to progressive Christian meetings. I heard Ken Raw and Jack Spong. Because Chris was in a committee with Dick Carter, I was often invited to some wonderful dinners where I got to talk to some of these people who were questioning. I was reading Spong and meeting him for the first time, said to him, "You explained so beautifully and simply ideas I struggle to communicate, particularly to my children." He laughed and hugged me and said, "That's my job." I want to finally do a reading from Jack Spong's last words. He calls it my mantra, and it was the second reading at his funeral. I'm relying on there we go. I cannot tell you who God is or what God is. No one can do that. The only thing I can tell you is how I believe I have experienced God. Even then, I must face the possibility that I'm being delusional. So let me speak subjectively, for that is all I can do. I experience God as the source of life, which means that the only way I can worship God is by living fully. I experience God as the source of love, which means that the only way I can worship God is by loving wastefully. I experience God, in poor Tillich's words, as the ground of all being, which means that the only way I can worship God is by having the courage to be all that I am capable of. I am Christian. That means that when I look at the life of Jesus, as that life has been refracted to me through the tradition and through the scriptures, I see a life so fully lived that I believe I discern the very source of life in him. I see a love so wastefully given that I believe I experience the very source of love in him. I see one who has the courage to be all that he was created to be. So I experience the very ground of being in him. I stand in awe and wonder before this life. And joining St. Paul, I say a profound yes to this life. Yes, I believe that in this life, I have met and experienced the very presence of God. And he goes on. You'll find it on Google if you want to have a look at it. And so I just want to finish today by saying that, and by saying that what Spong particularly and Borg and Raw gave me was the relief of being able to accept being fully human, that there was mystery, and that I did not have to explain it all. Thank you.
And for two things, especially for your honesty, for your story, and also for that beautiful reading from the man that we're honouring today. A very appropriate way to finish that with his words. That brings to a conclusion now our three speakers, and we have a double possibility now. Those of us who are present in the Ewing Centre here we'll actually move from this place into the hall, where you will find some tables and chairs, and you'll find modest refreshments. Please help yourself there. And this is now open for discussion for you as long as you like. We won't come in and ring any bells, but just discuss what you have heard today and perhaps what your own experience is. And so that there is a time to be together, which is part of the reason for us having these meetings as well. For our Zoom participants, we will continue. I will remain here with the Zoom participants, and Greg, who's our technical person today, and I, and perhaps Dick Carter, who's here, might field the questions a bit. So we'll take a 2 or 3 minutes break while we set ourselves up here for the Zoom questions and allow those who are moving into the hall to do so. Thank you so much, particularly to those who've been here today. It really is lovely to see a group of people, and I hope you have a good discussion together. Thank you so much.